Somewhere in Washington right now, a small group of American intelligence analysts is building a file with one name at the top of it: Xi Jinping. Not a file about missiles or Taiwan or trade tariffs. A file about money, real estate, bank accounts, shell companies, family names buried under layers of paperwork designed so you would never find them. And for the first time, the law says this file cannot stay secret. By the end of this year, the United States government is required by an act of Congress, however, to publish it. This isn't a leak. It isn't a rumor from an anonymous source on a forum. It's Section 513 of a federal law, and it has a deadline. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what this report's going to say, why it's happening now, and why it matters to you no matter where you live. Let's start with the law itself, because this is not speculation. This is public record. It's called the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2026, and it was signed into law in December, tucked inside the annual defense policy bill. Buried inside it is Section 513, officially titled Report on the Wealth of the Leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. The text of the law is public on Congress's own website, and it is unusually specific. It orders the Director of National Intelligence, working with the Secretary of Defense, to publicly post, not classify, post, a report on the personal fortunes of China's most powerful people. Not just Xi Jinping, all 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, the small body that functions as China's collective dictatorship. And beyond that, the full 25-member Politburo, the true inner circle of the Chinese Communist Party. The law demands evidence of physical and financial assets these leaders own or control, whether directly or hidden through someone else. That includes real estate, inside China, but also explicitly in Hong Kong and Macau, the 2 special territories where mainland money likes to disappear into. It also demands the identification of every financial proxy, business associate, or shell entity used to conceal who really owns what. A spokesperson for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has already confirmed on the record that the agency is actively working on it, the confirmed deadline, before the end of this year. Think about that for a second. An American law forcing American spy agencies to hand the public a paper trail leading straight to Xi Jinping's family finances. This has never happened at this scale before, and it's not even the first attempt. To understand why this law exists, you have to go back 3 years, to the fiscal year 2023 defense bill. Back then, Congress first ordered a similar report, a one-time snapshot of the wealth and corrupt activities of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. That report was supposed to land in late 2023. It didn't. It sat unfinished for 1.5 years, missing its deadline entirely under the outgoing administration. A group of House Republicans, led by Representative Andy Ogles, got frustrated enough to introduce a separate bill just to force intelligence officials to testify publicly about the delay. The report finally surfaced on March 21, 2025, released by the new Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. It was official, it was unclassified, and it named names. Congress liked what it saw enough to demand a sequel, a bigger, more detailed version, due this year. That sequel is the FY2026 report we're building this entire video around. So this isn't a one-off political stunt. It's the second chapter of an investigation that U.S. lawmakers across 2 different administrations have refused to let go of. Which raises the obvious question: what did that first report, the one from March 2025, actually find? That's where the story gets interesting. Before we get to the government's own findings, you need to understand something. American intelligence isn't inventing this story from nothing. It's building on more than a decade of investigative journalism that Beijing has spent just as long trying to bury. Go back to June 2012. Bloomberg News published an investigation into the extended family of Xi Jinping, at the time, the man about to become China's next president. Bloomberg's reporters traced roughly $400 million in assets connected to Xi's relatives: real estate, corporate holdings, investment vehicles. Beijing's response was immediate. It blocked Bloomberg's website across the entire country, a block that in large part remains in effect to this day. 4 months later, in October 2012, the New York Times dropped an even bigger bombshell, this time about Premier Wen Jiabao, the second most powerful man in China at that moment. Reporter David Barbosa spent months tracing corporate and regulatory filings, and what he found was staggering. Wen's mother, wife, son, daughter, and younger brother had accumulated assets worth at least $2.7 billion. The investigation won the Pulitzer Prize. It also got the New York Times website blocked inside China, a block that, again, has never fully been lifted. Wen Jiabao's family, through lawyers, denied every word of it, insisting no illegal business had taken place and that no shares were secretly held. But the pattern the Times uncovered is the same pattern investigators keep finding, over and over. Wealth hidden, behind layers of partnerships and investment vehicles. In the paper's own words, friends, colleagues, and business partners standing in as the visible owners while family money stays invisible. One of the Times' key findings involved Ping An, a massive Chinese insurance company. Investment partnerships tied to Wen's relatives held stakes worth as much as $2.2 billion at one point, built up in a sector Wen himself had regulatory oversight over. This is the mechanism you'll hear about again and again in this video. Power creates the opportunity, and family members become the vehicle. Even Chinese elites at the time understood how normal this had become. One of Wen's own former colleagues told the Times, quote, "In the senior leadership, there's no family that doesn't have these problems." By 2013, foreign correspondents who kept digging into these stories were finding their press credentials quietly not renewed. A pattern China analysts say continues to shape what can and can't be reported from inside the country. So when American intelligence agencies started building their own report years later, they weren't starting from zero. They were picking up a trail journalists had already been following and getting blocked for following since 2012. Which brings us to what U.S. intelligence itself found when it finally got its own report out the door in March of 2025. This is the report Congress is now treating as the floor, not the ceiling. The baseline the new 2026 report has to build on and go beyond. It's titled plainly, Wealth and Corrupt Activities of the Leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's published on the Director of National Intelligence's own website for anyone to download. Its headline finding, Xi Jinping himself had amassed more than $1 billion in assets, funneled and held through his relatives. Let that sit for a moment. This isn't a critic's estimate or a diaspora activist's claim. It's the conclusion of America's own intelligence community, printed in an unclassified public document. The report went further than just Xi. It named former Premier Wen Jiabao specifically, tying his case directly back into the government's own official assessment. It also delivered a number that explains why this problem is so much bigger than any one family, an estimate that up to 65% of officials in China receive some form of unofficial income through bribery or graft. 65%. Not a fringe minority, a majority of the system, according to America's own intelligence assessment. The report described corruption in China as structural, built into a one-party system with no independent oversight and no free press to hold anyone accountable. It also documented specific corruption cases inside the Central Committee, the 205-member body just below the Politburo, naming individual officials and the schemes they ran. And it acknowledged something important, that senior-level corruption is deliberately hard to prove, because after Bloomberg and the Times went public back in 2012, Beijing tightened information controls specifically to make this kind of research harder. In other words, the secrecy you're watching unfold in this video isn't accidental. It's a direct, documented reaction to earlier exposure. The report was itself a year and a half late, missing its original fiscal year, 2023 deadline, before finally landing under a new administration in March 2025. But once it landed, Congress didn't treat it as the end of the story. Lawmakers folded its findings straight into the next law, ordering a bigger, more detailed follow-up. That follow-up is the one due any day now, the one this entire video is about. And to understand why lawmakers wanted more, you need to understand the one thing that makes this story genuinely dangerous for Xi Jinping personally. Here's the irony sitting at the heart of this entire investigation. And it's the reason U.S. lawmakers keep calling it Xi's biggest vulnerability. Since 2012, Xi Jinping has run the most aggressive anti-corruption campaign in modern Chinese history. According to the U.S. intelligence community's own report, nearly 5 million officials at every level of government have been disciplined under that campaign. 5 million people investigated, demoted, expelled, or imprisoned, all in the name of cleaning up a corrupt Communist Party. Xi has used this campaign to purge political rivals, consolidate his own power, and present himself publicly as the man finally standing up to elite corruption. But American analysts who've studied the campaign describe it as something else entirely. As much a tool for enforcing political loyalty to Xi personally as it is a genuine governance reform. And that's precisely where the hidden wealth reporting lands its hardest punch. If the man running the anti-corruption campaign is himself sitting on more than $1 billion in family assets, according to his own country's chief rivals' intelligence agencies, the entire campaign starts to look less like reform and more like a purge of anyone who isn't loyal to him. This is the exact contradiction that makes this story so combustible inside China, even though almost none of your audience will ever be able to read it there. It's not a foreign accusation of ordinary greed. It's a foreign documentation of the gap between what the Chinese Communist Party publicly preaches and what its own leadership privately practices. And it's a contradiction Beijing cannot simply argue its way out of, because doing so means either admitting the wealth exists or admitting the anti-corruption campaign was never really about corruption at all. That contradiction is exactly why Congress didn't stop at one report, and why the version coming this year is built to go so much further. So let's get specific about what Section 513 actually orders investigators to produce, because the detail here matters. First, personal wealth, financial holdings, and business interests, named individually for Xi Jinping and each of the 6 other members of the Politburo Standing Committee. Second, the same categories of information, but expanded out to the full 25-member Politburo, China's broader ruling inner circle. Third, physical and financial assets these leaders own or control, whether the ownership is direct or indirect and hidden through someone else. Fourth, real estate. And the law is explicit that this covers property inside mainland China, as well as property held in Hong Kong and Macau. Fifth, investments and financial accounts held outside mainland China altogether, the kind of offshore structures that are almost impossible for ordinary researchers to trace. Sixth, and maybe most important, the identification of every financial proxy, business associate, or shell entity used to disguise who actually owns what. This last point is the one that separates this report from a simple list of numbers. It's designed to expose the mechanism, not just the total. The law even instructs investigators to treat the March 2025 report as their starting baseline, meaning this new version is required to go deeper, not repeat what's already public. There's also a provision most people miss. The Director of National Intelligence has to formally assess whether every part of the intelligence community actually cooperated in building this report, or whether any agency quietly dragged its feet. That single requirement tells you something. Lawmakers clearly expect resistance from somewhere inside the system itself, and they built in a mechanism to expose it if it happens. There's also a related bill in Congress, the Pictures Act, aimed at pushing this even further, literally seeking photographic evidence to accompany the financial findings. Picture that for a moment, not just numbers on a page, but images of the actual properties, the actual holdings, tied directly to specific names. If that provision survives, this story stops being an abstract financial report and becomes something the public can actually see with their own eyes. And once it's published, unclassified, in public, there is no putting it back in the box. China's government isn't waiting for the final report to react. It's already on the record, furious about the law itself. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun told reporters at a routine briefing that the entire FY2026 defense bill, this provision included, hypes up the China threat. He went further, accusing Washington of interfering in China's internal affairs and harming its sovereignty, security, and development interests. Beijing said it is, in its own words, strongly dissatisfied and firmly opposed, and confirmed it has lodged formal diplomatic protests with Washington more than once. This is the same government that blocked Bloomberg's website in 2012, blocked the New York Times website the same year, and has restricted foreign correspondence ever since those two stories broke. In other words, the response to this new report is already following the exact same playbook Beijing has used for over a decade: deny, block, and protest rather than open the books. And that reaction on its own tells you something important about how much this specific kind of pressure actually worries the men it's aimed at. Because Beijing can dismiss criticism of its military, or its trade policy, or its human rights record, and largely absorb the political cost. Personal wealth is different. It's not abstract policy, it's names, families, and property. And that kind of exposure is much harder to spin. Now here's where I want to slow down, because this isn't just a story about Chinese politics. It's a story about leverage, and leverage always eventually reaches you. For Washington, a public, documented paper trail on senior CCP wealth becomes a tool, a foundation for future sanctions, travel restrictions, or asset freezes tied to name individuals rather than vague policy statements. For the finance and compliance world, this report becomes a reference document. Banks, law firms, and due diligence teams tracking politically exposed persons will be citing pieces of this for years. For real estate markets in places like Vancouver, Sydney, London, and Singapore, cities that have spent a decade absorbing opaque capital from mainland-linked buyers, a public list of proxies and shell structures gives regulators something concrete to finally investigate. For the Chinese diaspora in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and across the Chinese communities of North America, Australia, and Europe, this report is something different entirely. Official, foreign confirmation of what many already suspected, but were never allowed to say inside China itself. And for ordinary people living inside mainland China, none of this will even be visible. The report will be blocked the moment it's published, the same way Bloomberg and the New York Times were blocked back in 2012. That gap between what the rest of the world will be able to read freely and what China's own citizens will never be allowed to see is maybe the most important detail in this entire story. It's also why this video and reporting like it ends up mattering more than a typical news cycle. Because for the people it's actually about, this will be the only version of the story that ever reaches them. So where does this actually go from here? Let's walk through the realistic timeline. The law requires the report to be posted publicly before the end of this year. That's the hard legal deadline. Given that the first version, back in 2023, ran a year and a half late, don't be shocked if this one slips too. But the legal requirement to eventually publish it doesn't go away just because a deadline is missed. Once it lands, expect immediate amplification. From Washington policy circles, from Taiwan and Hong Kong-focused outlets, and from exactly the kind of geopolitics audience watching this video right now. Expect Beijing's foreign ministry to respond within hours, using close to the same language it's already used: smear, interference, hyping up threats. Expect renewed congressional pressure to attach real consequences to the findings. Sanctions bills, hearings, and follow-on legislation like the Pictures Act pushing for even more transparency. And expect this story to resurface again and again over the next 2 to 3 years, because this is now a recurring legal requirement, not a one-time report. Congress has shown, twice now, that it isn't going to let this file close, which means the file on Xi Jinping's family wealth is going to keep growing, publicly, legally, and on a fixed government schedule, whether Beijing likes it or not. So here's what we actually know, laid out plainly one more time. A U.S. law, Section 513 of the FY2026 Intelligence Authorization Act, orders American intelligence to publicly expose the wealth of Xi Jinping and China's top 25 leaders before the end of this year. It builds directly on a March 2025 report that already found over $1 billion in Xi family assets and evidence that unofficial income touches the majority of Chinese officials. It builds on more than a decade of investigative journalism. Bloomberg in 2012, the New York Times the same year. Reporting Beijing tried to erase by blocking both outlets' websites entirely. And it sits directly on top of the greatest contradiction in modern Chinese politics. A leader who purged nearly 5 million officials in the name of fighting corruption, while sitting on hidden wealth of his own, according to America's own intelligence findings. This is a story that is not finished. It's a story with a legal deadline, sitting in front of us right now. And that's exactly why I built this channel. To follow the money that powerful people spend enormous effort trying to keep hidden. If this kind of reporting matters to you, subscribe to The Business Architect, because I'll be covering this report the moment it's actually published, line by line. And if you want to talk to me directly about this story, about a source, about anything connected to hidden money and power, I'm reachable on Signal. My username there is the Business Architect 123.43. That's the Business Architect 123.43. I read every message myself, because the whole point of this channel is that the truth about where power hides its money shouldn't depend on which country you were born in. I'll see you in the next one.